Welcome to the 2025 Bruegel annual meeting. I'm German Zettelmeier, the third director of Bruegel. It's my third annual meeting, the third that I'm chairing, and I'm super happy to be here with you at this beautiful location. I'm super happy to be up here with a fantastic panel, which I will introduce to you in a second. So let me just give you a sense of where I and my colleagues place this annual meeting, and particularly this panel. And so this has to do with what we see as the intersection of two moments in history. One is a moment in our personal history, in our institutional history as Bruegel. So it is our 20th anniversary, which gives us a chance to reflect and look back. And the other one, I think, is a very widely shared sense that we might be at a historical turning point. So we are at a moment which gives us the opportunity to look both back and forward. And we thought we would do it over roughly the same time horizons as our history. 20 years back, 20 years forward. And I think the reason why it is useful to look forward is because it gives you a sense of historical perspective, and perhaps also puts the current moment in perspective. And of course, the motivation for that, why I would very much want that historical perspective, is that I frankly don't know what to make out of the current moment. So looking back and looking forward fills me with a sense of pride and accomplishment. Certainly what Europe has achieved, and also what Bruegel has achieved. So we have retained and improved unprecedented historical prosperity. We Europeans have been leaders on probably the biggest secular challenge of our times, which is climate. We have maintained the peace within the EU, and we have been incredibly resilient against a whole slew of crises. What I see ahead still fills me with dread. I'm not sure we're winning the battle against climate action. We have a war on the outskirts of the EU and well within Europe, and that war might become a war in or on an attack on the EU. And most significantly, perhaps in the last 6 months at least, we have seen a lurch of authoritarianism in the United States, which is obviously not unprecedented. We have seen signs of this before, both in the US and also in Europe, but it is now, in a sense, much more existential than before. And one reason why it is so existential is because it is threatening the international order on which European prosperity has been built. So I really don't know how to look into the future. And by the way, technology magnifies all of this, right? So there's a sense that it offers enormous opportunity, but that it also magnifies the underlying divisions and may hand power to basically the forces of darkness. And so with me to make sense of all of this, I have a really fantastic panel, and so the intention of this panel was very much to look for diversity in viewpoints, in experiences, and so I will introduce them from my left to further to my left. So we are starting with Mario Monti, lifetime senator of the Republic of Italy. I hesitated for a second. I almost said of the Roman Republic, but then the Roman Republic became a victim of authoritarianism too, quite a while ago. The former Prime Minister of Italy, of course, former European Commissioner, and most importantly for us, the founding chair of Bruegel.
And for me.
Thank you. To whom we are incredibly grateful. He shaped us in many ways. One way in which he shaped us is by giving us our name. We then have Kira Marie Peter Hansen, member of the European Parliament and the Greens. She's from Denmark. We have Daniela Schwarze, who is now has a gainful, almost full-time job as board member of the Bertelsmann Stiftung, but is also an eminent academic, political scientist, and a policy advisor. And finally, on her way on a delayed train is Marietje Schaake from the Netherlands. She is a cyber expert, an AI expert. She was a member of the European Parliament, and she's now a non-resident fellow at Stanford University, and so she will be with us shortly. So let me go straight to my first question. And actually, before I do that, I'm told I always have to remind you that you will, in the end, be able to give us questions in person, but also online. And so if you want to do it online, you use an application called Slido, and the keyword is #Europe2045, just in one word. Okay, so let me turn to the first question, and where I would encourage you not to say quite yet how to save Europe. That's going to be basically, in the world, that's going to be the second question, okay? So the first question is, help us cut through the fog. So we were at various stages in the last 20 years, in moments which we thought could have been turning points, in a very bad way, right? Breakup of the euro, breakup of the EU after Brexit, fears of the demise of the EU's model of peace and prosperity turned out to be exaggerated. It's been a very tenacious union. We have kept it together. Are you optimistic that we will keep it together this time? How significant is what we are seeing today historically? Is it at the same level? Is it at a different level? Mario, please.
Thank you. Great privilege to be here. I see a continuity in this integration. To me, the big change which was creeping in and is now exploding more and more is everywhere. The changed horizon of political decision-making for a number of reasons that we are not going to examine here, from the social media to a perhaps rather longish period of absence of major dramas and catastrophes. The political process have seen politicians, I refer to politicians in countries, in our case in member states, not just in the EU, narrow their horizon, both in time, short-termism, and in space, localism, nationalism. It's only natural that of all objects of political decision-making, the one which was going to suffer most and will go on to suffer most is what? Is integration. Because integration is the opposite of a narrow localistic or nationalistic interest and can be appreciated and produce fruits only in the longer term. We have been seeing a first stage of these consequences in Europe with a number of difficulties, and my reading is that this is shifting gear now with the second advent of President Trump. This integration is going to concern the world in terms of system of governments, in terms of degree of multilateral cooperation, in terms of acceptance of the notion of cooperation, because the new hierarchy is no cooperation. The ideal is unilateral action. If anything, we, or at least the US, can tolerate bilateral negotiations, but multilateral negotiations. Now, I conclude this first round by noting with great concern a news that came out this morning, which concerns Brussels and the European Commission. The Commission was going to adopt the decision concerning Google, coming from a long inquiry under the Competition Commissioner. It has now been decided to postpone the decision because of US pressures and because, and may I submit that this shows that we are entering an open-ended trade agreement conditioned upon one of the partners, the EU in this case, behaves or not as a good boy. So an open-ended trade system, trade agreement. Yes, tariffs are provisional at this level, but behave well. Otherwise, if you touch on the digital, etc., we will go further. And to me, if the European Union, which has a huge potential now of rallying around it those many countries in the world, in all continents, who continue to love the US, but are not ready to tolerate the departure from the rule of law, if we work with them, urging the US to cooperate as much as possible with this effort of keeping the legacy of 80 years of cooperation going, we have a brighter prospect with all the difficulties, rather than if we genuflect punctually on these various threats.
Thank you so much, Mario. Kira.
Thank you very much, and I look forward to today's panel as well. So I think when you're looking back, you asked us, Jerome, to look back 20 years. I'm 27, so it's a time that I've grown up in. And I think what defines that time is that it's been crisis on crisis on crisis. We've had the refugee crisis, the financial crisis, climate crisis, Brexit, COVID, now war. So there's a lot of crises that are defining those past 20 years. But I think what is also defining that is that it's a post-war period. It's post the Berlin Wall, it's post-Soviet. It's a time where we were actually building Europe and integrating, as you said. So, and it was also a time where China joined the WTO. Like, a lot of good things happened. There was a lot of like belief that we could actually overcome the past horrible things that ever happened. But I think what we see now is, and looking at also the question on, is it worse now? Is this the turning point? I think what I would look at here is, first of all, the trust in democracy. We had a survey coming out from the YouGov Institute this spring, surveying young people between 16 and 27 in the UK, Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Greece, and Portugal. And I think these numbers are quite shocking, but also quite telling for where our union and the world stands. They showed that only 57% of this generation believes in democracy as the best way to govern, and that 21% says that authoritarian rule can be accepted under certain circumstances. And I think this very much shows that there's a distrust in our democracy and in our institutions, and that these institutions can tackle all of the before-mentioned crises. And I think this is what I would see as having the potential to be the turning point, because if you lose the faith in democracy, you risk having the foundation that we are built on erode. And we all know that if this foundation erodes, it's going to take generations to build back what we have today. And I think another part, and then, so I would say this is what could create the turning point. Then looking at why has it come, I would say that I think you mentioned in the end of your opening, the whole digitalization. I'm sitting myself with a little iPad. I've grown up with it, and I care about it deeply. But digitalization has, of course, created a lot of opportunities for connecting the world. We've seen how Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, have moved from the US to the EU. But we've also seen a digital sphere where misogyny, conspiracy theories, and hate speech has grown explosively, and where polarization is much more easy to happen. And with polarization comes this distrust in each other, but also in democracy. So I think this is one of the things we have to look at. And then I think when we look at all these crises, I think we can say that it's inevitable that we will have crises. Like, this is not the last thing that we will have to stand in front. And I think we also tend to overdo the state of these crises in the current. So this crisis feels much worse than what we remembered the financial crisis to be. But when we stood at the financial crisis, or when you did, I was just a little child, it probably also felt like the worst crisis ever. And I think what I'm hopeful about to see is that due to also this integration that you mentioned, the Union is actually quite equipped at overcoming them. And I would say we actually thrive in crisis as the European institutions. We're quite good at least when we're looking back, solving them, even though there are a little bit of steps on the way. So I think we have the possibility to survive the crisis, but then it's about making sure that the resilience is there for the institution to be strengthened to do that.
Thank you. Daniela, please.
Thank you very much, Jeromine. And I wish to say happy birthday, because after 20 years, I think we can safely say that you and Jean and Guntram have built a terrific think tank, which doesn't only reach out to Brussels, but really has been such a vocal player in domestic debates as well. So thank you. So is this time different? I would say yes. Comparing the situation to, the last 2 decades where we had subsequent crises, I would say the challenge we now have is so complicated because our system, the system Europe is being built on or has been built on is really under threat. Let me start with the economic system. We all know that our economic models don't hold anymore. Speaking to you as a German, by the day we discuss in Germany how the transformation of an economic system which has relied on open markets globally and also, of course, a European internal market, inward and outward investment, skilled labor, is now at, let's say, at a point where the transformation is not only from an economic perspective very difficult, but really from a social and political perspective. The challenges are very high. This comes at a time where our security order is under threat. And so Europe has to take more care of its own security. And again, at a point in time, because of our economic weakness, resources are scarce. We have some fiscal space in some member states, but the trade-offs that we are facing are very difficult to handle. And then thirdly, indeed, our democracies are under threat, both internally, a loss of credibility of institutions, a lack of feeling of being engaged, as you spoke about the young people, Kira, who feel that they are no longer part of a process where they feel they can make a difference. And we see that political parties play with those concerns and with those fears with an authoritarian or semi-authoritarian narrative, and that not only in those countries where we are worried about government composition and a backsliding of democracy, like for instance Hungary or Poland before the last elections of the government and parliament. And so I would say handling all those challenges at the same time require an extremely far-sighted, not only political effort by political decision makers, but almost a collective movement, including business, including civil society to a much stronger degree than we realize at the moment. Because in a way it is about negotiating a new contract. It's about, in some countries, negotiating a new social contract. It's, at least again speaking about Germany, it's about the relationship of the citizen with the state. We have just had a decision to reintroduce, at least for some parts of society, military conscription. And this raises questions about the relationship of the state and society, which at this point are not satisfyingly answered. There is a problem, and that is many decisions are taken without a solid and sustainable consensus. So they are being challenged over and over again. And Mario Monti spoke about the short-sightedness of political decision-making and decision-makers. And I see that as well. I see that in domestic circumstances. I also see it on the European level. And so my worry is here. But at the same time, we still have something we can be very proud of. We have a European way of life. We have a still, in some segments, really potentially really competitive economy. We just need to leverage all of that, and we'll come to that in the second round, I think. But I see all the risks. I see the fundamental changes we are facing, but I haven't lost all optimism, and I'll come back on that in a moment.
Great. Marietje, I did introduce you while you were not here, and welcome, and I'm sorry you had a hard time this morning. This is usually the moment when someone makes a joke about German trains. We cannot blame German trains. It was a Dutch train in this case, but anyway, we're very happy that you are here.
Well, thank you very much. You know, taking the scenic route was a good, track to sort of bring me back to 2005, 2 years before the iPhone was released, the year in which YouTube was launched, and when the value of Facebook, as it was then called, was around 100 million. It was the time that I started to think about politics for two reasons. One, concern for the rise of the far right. And two, that I was inspired by the campaign of Barack Obama, in which he, including through the use of social media, was able to sort of turn politics upside down. Remember, when President Bush was in office, we thought those were dark years, at least the progressives among us in Europe. And, some nostalgia for that level of depth could easily creep up on someone while staring out the window at 6 a.m. But thinking about, what I wanted to address today, one anecdote really popped back into my mind. It was the first day that I entered into the European Parliament in 2009, and I was in line to pick up my badge. And a returning member from the Netherlands, Thijs Berman, was standing in front of me. We shook hands and introduced, and he asked, well, welcome, do you have a sense of what it is you'd like to work on? And I said, well, I think we have to work on Europe's digital agenda, because it is so important that we build a digital single market as well, and that we, innovate more and make sure that there are no barriers. It's really sort of the fifth freedom, and, as one might be idealistic and motivated as a newly elected member, this is really how I felt. And he said, we've been talking about a digital agenda for 10 years, and trust me on this one, you will still be talking about it in 10 years. And I thought, my goodness, what a cold bucket of ice. This is typically the cynicism that we don't need in Europe, and it really kind of irritated me, if I'm honest. Not him personally, but the kind of comment. So, fast forward 16 years, here we are. We are still talking about the need to have a digital single market, to remove these barriers. And I think one of the many reflections that I have in thinking about the past 20 years, but certainly also on this tech topic that I work on most, is that in Europe it is entirely possible for people to celebrate progress relative to the past. So if someone attacks a European leader by saying, well, Europe is not fast enough, or there's many challenges to be overcome, then there can be a typical answer of, well, we've integrated this and this, it's much better than it was 10 years ago, or look at the budget, it's more than it was 7 years ago, or whatnot. And because we've been so focused on our own process of integration, of becoming something new out of, 27, 28, 20, whatever it was at any point in time, I think one of the biggest problems is that we have lost view, literally, of where the rest of the world was going. And this we can no longer afford, of course. There are many reasons, many of which have been mentioned, that this is indeed a moment that should be a turning point. It should lead to a Zeitenwende, as is part of the question here today. I'm not sure it will be. But I deeply feel it should be.
I found it very interesting what you said, because you are the first one on the panel who saw the possibility of a turning point in a positive direction, in a sense, right? Of really, in a sense, breaking old habits that have been restraining us. No?
Well, here's the thing. So I spent the past year talking about the outsized power of tech companies and how it hurts democracy. Started talking about it before Trump's election, his inauguration, with all the CEOs in the front row, and here we are today. And it is very easy, especially for younger people, to be entirely paralyzed by everything that's coming at us. And I fear that many of us feel a bit paralyzed because, look at the attacks on democracy and the rule of law. Look at the lack of leadership around the climate crisis, which, suddenly has moved to, last place in the priority lists. The deliberative breaking of the transatlantic alliance by our strongest ally is an absolute low point. And it is a crisis. The way in which our tech dependency can be weaponized in this context is absolutely disastrous for anything from national security to sovereignty to civil liberties and everything in between. Ukraine still fighting this war without a perspective of a winning solution against this act of aggression. I mean, I struggle with the times we are in. But the last thing we should do is to just stay bogged down in the concerns we have. It has to quickly be turned around into an opportunity for Europe, which I fundamentally believe it is. But we also need political leaders to actually sketch out what the change looks like and start acting immediately. So, enough of the strategic perspectives of digital sovereignty, strategic autonomy. Yes, we know what to do, but can we do now, please? And then, inspire people to come along, because I think if we only reflect on the times we live in and how hard it is, people will sort of sink back. And whenever I meet people and talk about the fact that this can be a clear opportunity for European leadership, there is a sort of longing for a perspective of hope. And so I think with the right energy and indeed coalitions between multiple actors, this definitely can be done. But we need a bit of self-confidence in our many abilities in Europe. And not have others tell the story about us in that we are sort of a lost continent and that it's done and over with.
Okay, so now is the time to look forward. And drawing on some of the things that you said in the first round, let me tell you how I think about it. So two things I picked up is that, in a sense, the two most existential things we have to worry about is the state of democracy inside the EU and the international order, and perhaps the role of tech in potentially magnifying some of these problems internationally, because we may be left behind further unless something changes here. And so the fundamental question that I have is whether what we see in societies, what we see have seen in the United States, what we are seeing in many European societies, and what we see internationally will force us to change, not just in the sense, or not mainly in the sense that we hope, namely as a disciplining device to overcome, the remaining divisions, essentially the Draghi narrative, which is an old European narrative. We improve under crises and so forth, but that it may force us to change in ways that essentially undercut what we are most proud of, that undercut the achievements, because they make our model of, openness, integration, rule of law, essentially a love with cooperation and rules untenable, right? And the way that this could happen is, for example, if we decide that the preservation of democracy requires shutting us off. Very interested in the Danish experience on how one balances these things, and whether in effect we should look to Denmark as a model for how to push back populism by becoming tougher on immigration, or whether this is the wrong path. But even more internationally, right? So the whole idea is that, you know, to a significant degree, our post-war structure in the EU was created to control our own demons, the European demons. If we are forced to turn ourselves into so-called carnivores, because the others are carnivores, will that basically undercut our own internal model, which we believe has been the foundation for peace in the EU? So maybe we can turn ourselves into some sort of, you know, more militarized power that starts to act like the others, and in effect gives up on the rules-based principles at the international stage. Can we do that without giving up on our own internal rules-based principles? So can we preserve, if you like, a society of herbivores inside the EU while becoming a carnivore internationally? So I do see the standard upside of greater discipline, of being challenged, and indeed the EU has reacted well to these things. It has not typically reacted in necessarily in a transformative way. I think there have been incremental improvements around the way, but some old habits are very difficult to dislodge. But there is a sense that, you know, the stress on transforming ourselves can also break the model in the way that just ends a completely unprecedented experiment in prosperity and stability in Europe. So that's basically my worry about 2045. Now, I'm going to start in reverse order, in part because we started getting into a dialogue, and because I think that Marietje has a more optimistic version of my story. So go ahead, and then we'll go around here.
Well, maybe that's not so hard, because I actually think the opposite could as well be true. That indeed, because we've been, and it sort of links to what I said in my introduction as well. You know, we've been growing out of a deep understanding of the past, but also of, you know, being more separate and coming together. And I think for anyone who was not motivated by what is happening geopolitically, it is now, you know, unavoidable. There's just no way of saying, you know, let's forget about the threats because of our dependencies in defense, the threats because of our dependencies in energy, the threats because of our dependencies in tech. And I don't see any country escaping this, not even the ones who think that they can be, you know, better at pitching the nostalgia of the transatlantic relation that they have bilaterally, which seems to be the flavor of the day, which I think is entirely misguided. So maybe coming back to the tech sovereignty issue, because I think it connects a lot of the things we need to do, give a boost to our innovative competitiveness, strengthen our defense and resilience, and also safeguard our democracy. And one of the big elephants in the room, and let me just put it out here at a gathering of a think tank that focuses on the economy, is the European private sector. They are incredibly pragmatic towards the Trump administration, presumably thinking that this would avoid, you know, some kind of wrath, or presumably thinking that it actually helps them throw overboard some of the annoying sustainability requirements that they, you know, that they were stuck with for the past years. I don't know what the thinking is, but I think there's an urgent need to bring on board the private sector in the risks to the European continent and make them part of the solution. Because, of course, politicians and certainly the European Commission cannot do it alone. I've heard a lot of criticism of the so-called trade deal. You know, there's a lot to dislike about it. But of course it is the member states that give the mandate for the negotiations, and of course it is the businesses that are pushing the governments to go for a deal, for certainty and predictability, for the worst of the best of worst solutions and so on. And so this whole moment of using the anti-coercion instrument, this moment of, as Mario Monti said, standing firm for our competition policies and our principles, is of course informed by what the private sector is telling the member states, what the member states are telling the Commission. And so, another thing I reflected on this morning is that in 2005, Viktor Orban was a member of the opposition, and how there was a time when the populist anti-democratic forces in Europe were threatening to leave the Union. And this was then a concern. Would there be an exit, a hexit, a plexit, whatever? And suddenly we are faced with a different strategy, which is, we're gaining strength, we're going to undermine the project from within. So there should probably be a sort of eye to eye on, are you with us or against us? On the member state level, on the private sector level, that in order for this continent, with our allies that are not in the EU, to survive in every aspect of the word, we need buy-in. And we cannot have a sort of pick and choose. And I think that there's been too much picking and choosing. Okay, I have not even talked about the digital autonomy stuff that we also need. But maybe on an optimistic note there, if, besides the whole talk about regulation and simplification, which we could have a whole panel about, but I'll park it for now. If we choose to actually start making different choices on our tech spending, if we stop subsidizing Silicon Valley and the US stock market as governments, as consumers, as businesses, as public institutions, there will be a huge ripple effect. Why? Because it will, first of all, boost European alternatives, but it will also send a signal to markets and investors, including those very investors that are supporting this administration, because money talks. And what I'm worried about is that there are some gaps between the strategic points on the horizon, digital sovereignty, strategic autonomy, and where we are today. And one of those, very concretely, and maybe you all can help here, because I think think tankers, researchers, but also governments should play a role here, is politicians don't have enough of a handle of the status quo. So for a lot of people, the idea of investing in European tech invites images of more spending of money that we don't have, of difficult budget issues. But if we knew better how much we're already spending on cloud of US tech companies, on, AI applications, cybersecurity tools, infrastructure, and what have you, data centers, then we would also know what it would mean if we would direct 10, 20, 30% of that budget in a different direction. And then it becomes a story that's an ambitious one, but it's manageable. And it becomes an actionable set of steps towards a different reality, instead of a sort of, paying lip service to a new world we would like, but that we're not moving towards.
Right. Daniela, please.
So let me pick 2 points from your reflections, Jérôme. The first one was, yes, we are moving towards a power-based international order with the set of rules we still have weakening basically by the day. And we see that power constellations are changing, and we see that Europe has still a few allies it can work with more closely, but the world doesn't look good for us at the moment. Now, you asked whether the decline of, the necessity to survive in a power-based world will undermine our rules-based order. I would almost say it's the other way around. We need our rules-based order internally in order to play a role globally if we want to play that role together as Europeans. Now, you also said that you gave it as a perspective, Europe is moving towards being a military power. I don't see the EU moving into that direction, but what we will see is stronger military players on the member state level. We see how defense spending has gone up. We will see some kind of military cooperation between EU countries going up, but we will not see an integrated defense capacity for the European Union. I'm pretty convinced of that.
Not even in 2045?
I don't think so. I think because this is really the core of national sovereignty, and in order to make that leap, to transfer any sovereignty in the field of hard security, or also cyber and so on, it would require such a far-sighted understanding that we are part of a political project where we are willing to delegate that capacity. I don't see that leap happening. We have failed on much lower bars of further integration. Take, for instance, the digital market, right? And so unless we manage those steps, I do not think we will truly integrate military capacities and the authority to command them. So what we will have is strong EU member states, more militarized Poland, Germany, France, others, a closer cooperation with the UK, again, and we are seeing that rapprochement, which is important both in the area of security, but also in the area of reviewing the economic deal we have with the UK, because the EU has no interest whatsoever to have a weak British neighbor, right? And so my view really is we need to still make sure that we manage Europe's role in the world from a position of inner strength, and that means, yes, the digital part you have emphasized for me is really core. Making progress in that regard is not only a question of competitiveness, it's a question of security. We will not be able to defend ourselves unless we control the systems. It's a matter of democracy. And so we have to realize, and that moment of truth that Marietje mentioned, to me is essential. We have to realize it is not only navigating a world which is less rules-based, where we have more competitors, it is that those competitors are actively undermining our systems inside the European Union, inside individual member states. If you look at the reports on hybrid interventions, the list is pretty clear. Russia's first, China's second, but also others we work with, like Saudi Arabia, Iran, of course. They come pretty high up in terms of hybrid interventions that are tracked, and those are not the ones that we can't even attribute. So we need the moment of truth. We are under attack inside the European Union in economic and security and democratic terms. We need to decide what we can do together to defend ourselves. As I said, in the area of hard security, I see this a competence on member state level with more cooperation, yes, but no transfer of sovereignty. And I do believe that in the area of technology and in single market integration and other areas, unless we make that leap forward now, I think we are in a very bad position to do so later.
Quick.
Can I just jump? Is this what? Yeah. Just a very quick response, which is, I agree with your diagnosis, but I think we have to be very clear. If we don't integrate on national security, we won't have a digital single market. Because the investments will include strategic ones, and, for example, assessments of what amounts to a national security risk when it comes to any kind of tech use or deal. Think Starlink in Italy. It won't be sustainable. It's not sustainable now, and it won't be in the future. So I think it might be helpful to just make all those consequences much more explicit and not pretend that we can pick and choose, that we can have the one and not the other.
Very quickly on that, if common defense assets, common satellite systems, common air defense, can we do that? Is that consistent with your national sovereignty on military model and in the EU? I think
we can develop them together, but the question of command, in my view, is essential. We can integrate on we can agree on joint command structures as we have with the NATO, but we will not integrate the sovereignty of putting your army somewhere, of deciding about your soldiers' lives. I don't think any of the European nuclear powers will be willing to integrate that part truly into a decision-making structure. So I think in terms of providing resources and providing military assets, we have to integrate. My point is no member state is likely in the next 20 years to give up sovereign decision-making on hard security matters.
much.
And can I just say one thing on digital and integration? Yes. I think we have to get much better on thinking through those elements. We need to integrate intelligence services to a much stronger degree also. A lot is happening in cyber defense at the moment in terms of reflecting how this can be done. But the moment we lose US support, which we still have in those areas, we will realize how little we can do as individual member states. But again, I believe that sovereignty will not be surrendered to the EU level, given all the trends and elements we have discussed in national democracies at the moment.
The idea of having an EU that is highly militarized at the national level without a transfer of sovereignty, a significant transfer, makes me very nervous. Right, that is part where I'm
not saying it's a good scenario. You asked us what is
I did. It's my fault for asking you gave a great answer. Please, Kia, and thank you for being patient.
No, I think it was also very interesting to listen to that discussion, and I think it's quite. I think coming from a young generation, I'm less worried about a militarized Europe, which I think also is quite interesting in itself. But I think let me start by saying I fully agree that we need to stand firm also against the US, for example. But I think we need to also be very much aware whether we have the strength, because if we don't have the military, the economic, the digital, the infrastructural strength to do it, Trump can take Greenland, for example. I'm just saying that I think we need to be very much aware that if we risk escalating a conflict without having the means to also win it, the consequences can also be quite severe. And now we also see that there are American spies in Greenland territory, for example. So at least coming from a purely Danish perspective, that is a very, very scary scenario, making it, I think, maybe giving a bit more understanding of why the EU Commission is doing a trade deal that is a very bad trade deal, but at least some kind of settling of the situation. And then let me end by saying I think two aspects we need to keep in mind as well is the rising inequality and the cost of living crisis. I think if we want people to buy in and to trust politicians and to trust institutions, they need to see that they can also make ends meet. I think that we've seen in the history books the best way to make extremists rise is by making sure that people don't have the means to cover their own needs. And then as well, I think we need to discuss how do we create a democratic mindset. We have this word in Danish on like democratic literacy. So it's like you don't just need to learn about it in school, or it's not just something institutional, but it's something you kind of feel, and it's a way of understanding what you are and what your nation are in the world. And I think that is very important because especially when we see within the EU that member states are also turning against us. They're not just like they're doing it because the population wants them to do it to a large extent. So making sure that citizens actually buy into the idea of European values and European democracy, I think is very, very crucial. Otherwise, we as politicians can decide X, Y, Z, but we need also the people to back it.
Mario, you got your own.
Can I make two concrete proposals based on those very important reflections on the self-confidence of Europe to be regained and on the role of the private sector? First proposal, in the line of stop subsidize Silicon Valley, the US financial system and all that. There are two sub-proposals here. One, at the G7, European countries agreed to accept the exemption from the global minimum tax of US companies. That was done in good faith to moderate the trade requests and the tariff requests of the US. That moderation has not generated much moderation in return. I understand the agreement to grant this exemption to US companies is not yet legally perfect and implemented at the OECD. EU and its member states should not go ahead with that. Second, I find it simply incredible that the EU has also accepted, to please the US, to refrain from mentioning the digital tax as one potential source of own resources in the next MFF. Now, this means that we have agreed not to even consider for the next 10 years in the end this. I find this an abnormal renunciation to the minimum of sovereignty, and this should also be reverted. So that much to be concrete for the first point. On the second point, the private sector, I think this is a critical point. When the single market was built in the 80s, the private sector, I should add, the EU-based, but also the US-based private sector, were propellers of the European single market. Now they continue to be so in words, but let me be a bit cynical. We have the Letta report, the Draghi report. I'm proud of having produced myself, at the request of the Commission in 2010, a Monti report. I was the only one to be asked to produce a report before I became a former Italian Prime Minister. All this, in particular the Draghi report, contains excellent proposals and materials. But what is the message that goes out there to the public? EU, wake up. EU, not member states. So this is really counterproductive. So the EU should do much more in terms of enforcing the rules that exist for the single market and for competition, do exactly the opposite of what it is doing today on Google, and be going out for Germany, for Italy, when they do things that are in blatant contradiction with the single market for financial services and banks, etc., and call with the President of the European Council a special European Council where the Commission sets up a number of precise commitments in the enhancing of its enforcement action. And the member states in the Council are very concrete in accepting the dismantling of this and that. Otherwise, we have very vicious circles. The reports, a series of hopes based on good proposals, but then everybody is disappointed because the Commission does not have the strength to overcome the national resistances. Business goes to Brussels to complain, and at the same time goes to the national capitals to court them, to give them protection from the single market. So this is not serious. This is not serious. And therefore, maybe a concentrated effort in one big, well-prepared European Council with, I conclude, a little lesson of history. Not everybody remembers, but Jacques Delors' memoirs devote a few pages to this, that when the European single market was launched, was decided upon in the Milan European Council of 1985, the decision to call the first intergovernmental conference to produce the single act and then the single market was not adopted, although it was a European Council, at unanimity. Prime Minister Thatcher, the Prime Ministers of Denmark and Greece were against. The President called a vote. Craxi, the Italian Prime Minister, called the vote in coordination with the law, and the majority was in favor. And that went ahead. We would not have had the single market itself ruled then at qualified majority for most topics, had there not been that original sin or virtue, I don't know. But let's stop complaining about things that will never, ever happen if we continue this game. So a moment of recognition of responsibility must come. There are illustrious precedents, and if not, let's stop talking about more market integration.
Thank you. So we are almost out of time, but I will, of course, let the panel go over for about 10 minutes to get some questions. I have a large number of great questions on Slido, but I want to take a few from the floor, and then we will add some Slido questions. So I'm looking for hands. The gentleman in the first row, please wait for the mic and identify yourself.
Filippo Pavano, CJTS journey. I remember your metaphor from the previous year on the barbarians at the gate. But the Dark, creating this historical metaphor, the Dark Ages also brought a lot to the Western civilization, like the city of Venice, which was like an escape place for the Romans at the beginning. So my question is, what are the biggest feasible opportunities you see for Europe now? And what can Brussels do else to unlock them? And possibly in a broader sense, what is the mission for Europe on the global stage in this quite intense geopolitical landscape? Thank you.
Thank you. The lady in that middle, yes, you. Identify yourself, please.
Thank
yes.
you. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
My name is Ottilia Dand. I represent Temasek.
Right.
And I fully agree with MEP Peter Hansen that the weak link in the entire story is actually the citizen. All the member state governments that we have, presuming that every country in the EU is a democratic one, is a reflection of the society. And the reflection of the society is not necessarily flattering in many cases. And it is the reflection of society that is short-sighted and localized and looks as its own navel. Do you believe that there is a way that we can step up education of European citizens to have a long-term view and perspective that strengthens rather than weakens Europe? Thank you.
Okay, please go ahead. And we'll stop it here, then I'll go to Slido. Yep.
Thank you. Good morning. Maxime Bureau from a 3M company. So it's good you mentioned the private sector, Professor Monti, Mayeke. Look, I think the private sector, you should invite them maybe one next year. That would be great too. But we are supporting the single market every day. I think, let's be clear, maybe not 100% of us, but many of us, because it's actually common sense to invest here. So we did not discuss regulation simplification. Let's do it, please, because one of you, let's do it. That's what we need absolutely, so to invest more. So maybe you can share with you, where will you start if tomorrow you have one priority for simplification? But that's what we really need, and why you do it. Not for business. You do it, to Kira's point, for the jobs in Europe. With a 15% penalty on our manufacturing in Europe, we lose jobs in Europe. So we have an opportunity with the EU, with simplification, actually to attract more investment. So let's do it to create jobs. Thank you.
Okay, so I have a feeling probably several of you will want to speak about this. I'm going to add 3 more questions from Slido and sort of suggest who might take them, but feel free to ignore me and have a different division of labor. So there's a question on young people do not believe in democracy because it does not work for them because they are in the minority. how can we establish a new intergenerational contract? So it will not surprise you, Kira, that question will go to you, but it can go to the other panelists too. Then a very important question that I'm concerned with: do panelists think there is much appetite for a rules-based order beyond Europe? Considering the show of solidarity between non-Western states seen most recently at the SCO summit, what can Europe do to promote its vision? So is this essentially just our own nostalgia? Or are we right in assuming that, maybe the majority of countries do not particularly like being bullied either by China or by the United States and should have an intrinsic interest in a rules-based order? And then finally, many leading politicians want to make my country great again. With the EU being under external threat, can make the EU great again become the engine for integration in selected areas, even for the nationalists? So basically, how far can we get with EU nationalism as a motor for integration? And of course, my thinking there is, we probably can do something from it, but how does that then square with the idea of safeguarding at least some bits of the international rules-based order? So those are three questions in addition to the ones we heard, and particularly on education. And at the end, it would be nice if at least one of you said something about how much faith you have in regulatory simplification as something that can in of itself reignite European growth. And if you have a view on what the Commission is trying to do there, that would be also much appreciated. So let's go around this way again, because I do want to give you the last word, Mario. So Marietje, please.
Okay, I don't really know how to choose, but I wanted to pick up also on something that Kira said, and then hopefully I'll come to some of the other answers, because I think it's very profound. Because you talked about Greenland and you said, excuse me, this is a very Danish point of view. It shouldn't be. The issue of Greenland is a European issue, and actually one that fundamentally touches on the rules-based order, or what's left of it. But I would also say the chances of the United States bullying the Trump administration bullying Denmark over Greenland through tech dependency are probably greater than any kind of, more physical or kinetic intervention. So, we need to connect the dots a little bit, I think, in terms of where vulnerabilities lie, how economic dependency can be weaponized now for geopolitical gains. So that was just something that I wanted to say, and I was actually encouraged by you saying that the young generation appreciates the need for strong defense, because for a long time that was actually not the case. For a long time, if we would be in a panel with representatives of the younger generation, and if there would be a question of, for example, who would want to serve in the military to defend their country or the European Union, not a single hand would go up. And so perhaps the wake-up call is already happening. And perhaps the wake-up call is also happening among nationalists, because I was quite, not amused, because there's not a reason to be amused, but it struck me when the leader of the Alternative for Deutschland was confronted with the consequences of the trade deal. She said it was a bad trade deal. And it's interesting because, of course, there was a lot of alignment between Trump through Elon Musk and the Alternative for Deutschland really pulling herself up as a like-minded leader. But ultimately, this kind of nationalism may also clash. So there's only so much that the sort of big family of nationalists international can maybe enjoy together. Maybe one thing on rules and simplification, also the Draghi report. I personally think it is most unfortunate and unhelpful that the push on deregulation comes at the moment when we're also under attack for our regulation by the US, because it makes it really hard to defend. Now, of course, anyone who has any common sense would always want to have agile processes of any kind, right? It's good for service delivery, whether from the government or to help companies. It makes sense to review whether laws are executed the way they were intended. Is there any unnecessary bureaucracy? But the way these moments are meeting now, prioritizing of simplification by the Commission while under attack for rules over regulation, any regulation by the Trump administration is very unhelpful. So we need to make sure that we're not, and I hate this expression, but maybe I'm just going to use it because it's illustrative, we need to be careful that we don't throw away the baby with the bathwater, that the idea of our sovereignty is not, you know, brushed off as, oh, it was just, you know, bureaucratic. There's an absolute legitimate right to democratically adopt laws and then to see them enforced, and not to have anyone externally, through whichever means, trying to undermine that. And so, yes, on making sure that you know, we are as good as we can be with the single market, continue to integrate it, and we remove obstacles that are unnecessary of any kind. But that we don't make this into a tool of those who want to destroy the European Union anyway.
That's right. We have to keep the purpose of regulation in mind. Daniela.
So 3 quick points. One is, I agree with your analysis that we are in a downward spiral in discussing regulation because we have that pressure from the outside. We mustn't give in, but at the same time we know we need to change something within our own system. I just wish to add a nuance, and that is that pressure, that internal pressure, is not so new. Ahead of the last European elections, I sat in many meetings with corporate leaders who were thinking through how can we play a positive role, because essentially we weren't a stronger Europe. Mm-hmm. And for the first time there was a very sober undertone saying, but actually we want to be pro-European, but what the Commission and what the EU is doing, we can't really defend anymore. And this is a risk which I think was underestimated for too long. And we spoke earlier about the big coalitions that need to be built, where we need corporate leaders, where we need corporate engagement as much as we need more civic engagement to develop that new model which we need. And I think those tones were, at least from what I observed, were not taken seriously early enough. 2 more points. One on young people, democracy, education. So I think we must look not even to the member state level, but to the local level where young people live. It is essential to show young people that they are being heard, and this minority point which came from the Slido question, I think is really important, because if you look at demographic developments, if you look at voter structures, it is obvious that the young generation is a shrinking part in those who are allowed to vote, even if in some countries the age has gone down to 16, at least in some elections, European elections or local elections. And we need much smarter ways to oblige policymakers to take a long-term view on the consequences of their decisions, be it climate transition, handling climate change, or preventing climate change, but also handling the repercussions of climate change, pension systems, public finances. I think there are interesting first attempts to bring in youth councils, to bring in a really intergenerational perspective, but they are by far not spread enough and seen enough to make young people believe they are actually really involved. And I think it's a crucial point to find smarter ways and actually ask senior policymakers, how do they relate to this generation? How do they take up those concerns? I don't think this is necessarily an issue that the EU can tackle. It can push and give some examples, but it is frankly the obligation and the democratic need on the member state level and on the local level. And a final point on the rules-based order. Are we alone in wanting this, or are there others? Of course, the European Union has partners worldwide who want a rules-based order. Japan is one, South Korea, Canada. There are others as well. And I think what Europe has to do, it has to show, in particular through trade deals, that it is willing to set up, let's say, a new kind of rules-based order with like-minded countries. And that way, I think, those who right now feel they are strong because they can be destructive, in an ideal world will realize that this comes at a cost for them. And so I would argue Europe has to move forward as quickly and as adamantly as possible. And it has a huge asset to do that, because we have a huge single market.
Do you see India as a like-minded or potentially like-minded country? Because that's, I think, where the reference to the SCO went.
Sorry, I didn't.
Do you see India as a like-minded or potentially like-minded country?
Potentially,
because
yes.
we think India is very important for Europe.
I agree.
There is
India
the
is
SCO
very important.
reference, yes.
However, it is not undecided. It's sometimes classified as an undecided player. I think it plays its cards in a very smart way and will cooperate with Europe on some things, but will also balance its interests with others. If you look at India's economic ties, its military dependency still from Russia and imports from Russia in terms of armament, but also the new ties it has built with the US. I mean, it's a balancing game, and Europe needs to find out in which parts it is an interesting partner to India. And of course, India is a big and increasingly important player.
Thank you. Kira.
And thank you. There's a lot of questions to cover. I'll start. I think your point on Greenland also being a European issue is very, very important. And I think also just to correct myself a little bit, I think I said that young people are fine with the militarization. I think there's also geographical difference there. And I think maybe not only among young people, but also about member states in general. I think that is also quite important to be aware of, because what I see now, just looking at my own little group in the European Parliament, that you have the Scandinavians and the Baltics caring a lot about Ukraine and spending a lot of money on military capabilities. You have some Southerners colleagues who don't necessarily feel the threat in the same way and who don't think militarization is the way forward. We saw the same during the refugee crisis, just with reversed order, where the Southern European countries had a lot of issues with migration and refugees coming in, and the Nordic countries being, yes, well, maybe besides Germany, but the rest of the Nordic countries being like, okay, it's not that important necessarily. So I think there's also a gap in how you kind of approach European solidarity. And maybe it's always been there, but I think in times of crisis it can stand out a lot. And then moving to the whole issue of youth and democracy, and I think it's not necessarily just the youth. Like, you also have a lot of non-young people worried about democracy or like not trusting it, but I think of course the youth is important because they're the generation who hopefully is going to continue it. But I think you're right that the EU can do a little about it. Like, we can do funding for civil society organizations, we can do some information campaigns, but I do agree it needs to come from below. I think it needs also to come from parents and from the schools and from the educational system if you want to get this feeling of like living as a democratic citizen and feeling that. And then I think what we can structurally do is to ensure, you mentioned the tech dependency and how the US can also use that as a way to expose us. And I think that's also an area where you see that algorithms are radicalizing people and of course also undermining democracy in that sense. And then I think there's also a part of like managing expectations between voters and politicians. I think a lot of young people who voted in the 2019 election, there was the whole green wave, maybe didn't feel like what they had voted for and the whole campaign on climate actually was met. And not necessarily because the political system didn't deliver as much as they could, but because you had a generation of voters expecting more. And this expecting more, I think we need to tackle, because can you expect more, or do we need to have that expectation management between the political level and the civil level? And as well, when you're looking at the cost of living crisis, like, I think there's no wonder why you lose faith if you're growing up in a country where you can't go out and have a house and a job before you're 30. Like, it's quite obvious why you lose faith.
Mario, please solve it for us.
I'm convinced that the world has appetite for rule-based order. We are very lucky because we are the holder, we Europeans are the holders and have largely cooperated in preparing this good, of a good which is multilateralism, all the things you said. Now, the abdication of the current president of the US from world leadership, because you see that as an aggressive and intimidating attitude, which it is, but it is also an abdication from leadership, without, I'm afraid, for America, turning quickly from leadership to actual command, which requires other talents which do not seem to be there in great supply in the present leader. But so there is a demand in the world for rule-based order. We have that in Europe. That good has become more scarce since the US is no longer supplying it. And a scarce good has an increasing value. And this value is appreciated by many in the world. Countries which are keen on this were mentioned. That's why I do believe that a sort of loose alliance of the likely-minded on these things should and could be launched. It's rather simple in concept to promote the concept of an alliance not antagonistic to the US, but at the same time not ready to give up on rule of law, multilateral governance, and, we forgot them a bit this morning, global public goods, climate change and public health in the first place. So my question is, will the EU, if ever it wanted to go down this road, will the EU be the appropriate body with others to launch this? I'm not sure, because not all member states of the EU might be sympathetic to this. But this might be the occasion, while preserving the integrity of that part of the European construction which is based on location, proximity, market, which has to be one. This would be based on values. Could be a more territorially sparse EU-like set of countries across continents. So, and within this context, I was asked what I think of the Google decision today. Well, first of all, I understand it's not a decision not to proceed, but it is a postponement of a decision, which is bad enough for the credibility of competition policy. I'm not sure I would have accepted this and remain in the position. But I remember very well the day that Eric Schmidt, then the CEO of Google, came to Brussels to congratulate us for the quite vigorous action that the Commission had undertaken on Microsoft. Because it's always like this, when they're little boys or girls, they like competition, and then they try to stop it. But that action on Microsoft, like the similar one on GE Honeywell, was taken under the deluge of very heavy lobbying from the US, Bill Gates or Jack Welch, Erkki Liikanen will remember, and under the strong private and public pressure of the then President of the US, George W. Bush, who many people were fearful of because he was not strange to the notion of wars. He started two in Iraq and Afghanistan. So he had to be taken with cautious respect. But the Commission did not stop. And the Commission gradually has acquired, with the national competition authorities in Europe and through the international competition network worldwide, with the US authorities, a high recognition as very able to administer this piece of a rule-based order. So it would be degrading twice for Europe to backtrack on this, because we would underline the genuflection to the US and we would erode one component of our ability to be top class in one aspect, one of the many aspects of managing a rule-based order.
Thank you so much. We are way over time. I've been a terrible chair. This has been a great panel, and we have fantastic sessions for you in store, including on the future of multilateralism, including of how Europe and Asia should engage. So please take a quick break, and we will see you back in the room very soon. Thank you.